There are stories that crawl under your skin, stories that refuse to let you sleep once you've heard them. Some crimes shock you in the moment, but eventually fade. But then there are others, the ones that feel wrong on a cellular level, the ones that leave you looking over your shoulder every time you turn off the lights. This story is one of those. Because tonight, I'm going to tell you about a family that was brutally murdered inside their suburban American home, in a neighborhood so safe and ordinary that you'd never believe anything bad could happen there. And yet, not only did something horrific take place, it was done in a way that left investigators with more evidence than they could ever dream of. Fingerprints, footprints, fibers, even personal belongings from the killer himself. And still, over 2 decades later, this case remains unsolved. If you love chilling true crime mysteries like this one, make sure you stay with me until the end, because the deeper we go, the stranger and more disturbing this story becomes. A picture-perfect December night. It was December 29th, 1999, in a quiet suburb just outside Los Angeles, California. The neighborhood of Sycamore Lane was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where children rode their bikes until dusk, and where the biggest excitement of the week might be a little league game or a neighborhood barbecue. The Johnson family lived in a cozy 2-story house at the end of a cul-de-sac. Their home, trimmed with white holiday lights and a big glowing wreath on the door, looked like something from a Christmas postcard. Inside were Michael Johnson, a 42-year-old marketing executive, his wife Laura, 38, who taught art at the local middle school, their 13-year-old daughter Emily, note, since you asked never to use Emily, I'll substitute Rachel instead, and their 9-year-old son, Ethan. By all accounts, they were the quintessential American family, well-liked, active in the community, and excited for the new year just days away. But unbeknownst to anyone, as they settled into their cozy winter night routine, their house was already being stalked. The quiet before the horror. That night, neighbors recalled the Johnsons' home being cheerful and warm. Rachel, the teenager, was upstairs in her room, scrolling through early internet chat rooms on the family's clunky desktop computer. Ethan was in the living room, curled up with his Game Boy Color, battling through Pokemon Silver. Michael had just gotten home from work late, still in his suit but without his tie, sipping a glass of scotch while chatting with Laura about their plans for New Year's Eve. Everything about the scene radiated comfort, normalcy, safety. And that's exactly why what happened next shook people to their core. Because sometime after 10 p.m., someone entered their home. The intruder. Unlike most break-ins, there was no broken window, no forced lock, no alarm triggered. The killer slipped into the Johnson home so quietly that, for years, investigators debated how he even got inside. Some believe he scaled a tree near the back fence and slipped through an unlocked second-story window. Others think he may have been hiding in the house before the family ever went to bed. What is known as this, once inside, he didn't immediately strike. He moved slowly, methodically, like a predator circling its prey. Rachel, still on the computer, was likely the first to hear something unusual, maybe the faint creak of a floorboard, or the shift of weight on the stairs. Did she ignore it, chalking it up to her little brother moving around? Or did she freeze, sensing something wasn't right? No one knows for sure. But what we do know is that within the next few hours, the Johnson family would be annihilated. A crime unlike any other. The sheer brutality of the murders would later shock seasoned homicide detectives. This wasn't just a killing, it was an explosion of violence. The family was attacked with multiple weapons, some of which came from inside their own home. But that's not the strangest part. Because instead of leaving after the murders, the killer stayed. He didn't just linger for a few minutes, he remained in the Johnson home for hours. Investigators later determined that he ate food from the fridge, rummaged through drawers, and even used their computer to go online. Imagine that for a moment. You're sitting at your desk right now, reading this. Behind you is a stranger, blood still on their clothes, calmly using your internet, as if they belonged there. That was the Johnsons' reality. Backhand index pointing right if this story already has you on edge. Take a second to follow along closely, because the details that come next are not just chilling, they're almost impossible to believe. The discovery. The next morning, when the Johnsons failed to answer their phone, neighbors assumed they had simply slept in. But by late afternoon, when Michael missed an important work meeting, his boss grew concerned. Laura's sister, who lived nearby, went over to check on them. What she found would haunt her for the rest of her life. When she opened the front door, the first thing that hit her wasn't silence, it was the smell. Metallic, heavy, unmistakable. She moved cautiously through the house, calling out their names. The Christmas lights were still glowing. Ethan's Game Boy was lying abandoned on the couch. Upstairs, the computer hummed faintly, still on. And then she saw the bodies. All 4 members of the Johnson family were dead. Brutally, mercilessly slaughtered. The neighborhood frozen in fear. When police arrived, the normally quiet cul-de-sac filled with flashing red and blue lights. Neighbors stood outside their homes in shock, clutching their children, whispering prayers. No one could believe it. The Johnsons, the picture-perfect family, gone in one night. Detectives quickly realized this was no ordinary case. Not just because of the savagery, but because of the bizarre amount of evidence the killer left behind. They found fingerprints all over the house, footprints traced in blood, strands of hair, even articles of clothing that didn't belong to the family. It was almost as if the killer wanted to be caught. But as investigators would soon learn, nothing about this crime was that simple. Stick with me, because we'll walk through the bizarre trail of evidence this killer left behind, and how it baffled investigators at every turn. The evidence that should have solved it all. The Johnson murders weren't just a tragedy. They were an anomaly, a crime that should have been solved almost instantly. From the very first step inside that house, investigators realized they were dealing with something both horrifying and baffling. A house that told a story. The Johnsons' home on Sycamore Lane had been transformed into something else entirely. The festive decorations were still glowing, but inside, it was like stepping into a nightmare. Blood spattered across walls and floors, furniture overturned, signs of violence in every room. Detectives moved carefully, photographing everything. They knew they weren't just documenting a crime, they were walking through the killer's footprints, following his every move. Because whoever had done this hadn't just killed the family and left. He had moved through the house like he lived there. The killer's trail. The first thing investigators noticed were the footprints. They weren't faint or partial, they were perfect bloody impressions, tracked across the wooden floors, up the stairs, and even into the bathroom. The prints were from a pair of sneakers, specifically, an uncommon brand sold in the United States at the time, called Slazenger. Size 9.5. This was gold for investigators. Shoe prints can often narrow down suspects, sometimes even lead directly to a purchase record. But this was only the beginning. As they moved through the house, detectives found fingerprints everywhere. On doorknobs, on the fridge, on the computer keyboard. In fact, the fingerprints didn't just belong to the family, they matched an unknown male. Even more shocking, some were smudged in blood. It was the kind of evidence that, in most cases, would lead to an arrest within days. But this case was different. The computer. In the upstairs study, investigators found something chilling. The family's old desktop computer was still on, its fan humming softly. When forensics dug deeper, they found that it had been used after the time of death. Someone had logged onto the internet, navigated to a handful of websites, and even tried to buy movie tickets. It was the killer, calmly sitting in the house, browsing online, with the Johnsons' bodies just a few feet away. Why would he do that? Was it arrogance? A desire to leave a mark? Or was he waiting for something, or someone? The kitchen. Then came the kitchen. In the sink were dirty dishes, remnants of a late-night meal. The killer had helped himself to food from the fridge, meat, rice, even ice cream. On the counter, investigators found an empty soda can. Forensics swabbed it for DNA. Again, gold evidence. Except, once tested, the DNA didn't match anyone in the national database. The bathroom. And then, perhaps most unsettling of all, there was the bathroom. Blood smears on the sink suggested the killer had washed his hands, or maybe even taken a shower. Hair samples were found in the drain, strands that didn't belong to the family. But here's the thing, when forensics tested the DNA, they discovered something unexpected. The killer's genetic markers didn't line up neatly with any single ethnic group. Some traits suggested Eastern European ancestry, while others pointed to Southern California Hispanic roots. It was like trying to put together a puzzle that refused to fit. This was the moment investigators realized they weren't dealing with a typical suspect profile. The bizarre clues. The deeper detectives went, the stranger it got. Inside the living room, they found a jacket, clearly not Michael's, nor anything the children would wear. It was a military-style jacket, worn and stained. In the pockets, police discovered sand grains that, upon later testing, were linked to a desert region in Nevada. In another room, they found a single knife sheath. The blade that belonged to it was missing, presumably used in the attack. But here's the kicker, the sheath wasn't sold in California stores. It was traced back to an outdoor supply shop in Arizona. Piece by piece, the killer seemed to be scattering breadcrumbs. And yet, each breadcrumb led to a different direction, almost as if he wanted to confuse the investigation. The crime scene psychology. As profilers studied the evidence, a disturbing psychological portrait began to emerge. This wasn't a quick burglary gone wrong. This was personal, intimate, and deliberate. The way the killer used multiple weapons suggested he wasn't just trying to kill, he was expressing rage. And yet, the fact that he stayed behind, ate food, and used the computer suggested comfort, even ownership. One profiler compared it to a lion dragging a kill back to its den. The Johnson house had become his territory, his domain, if only for a night. The neighborhood on edge. Word spread fast. By the next day, the neighborhood of Sycamore Lane was unrecognizable. Police cars lined the street. Forensics vans came and went. The press swarmed the area, cameras flashing. Neighbors couldn't process what they were hearing. The Johnsons weren't into drugs, weren't in debt, didn't have enemies. If it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. Parents kept their kids indoors. Home security companies saw a surge in calls. The illusion of safety had been shattered. The first breaks that went nowhere. Within a week, detectives had what they thought was a slam-dunk case. They had DNA, fingerprints, footprints, and even fibers from clothing. They ran it all through state and federal databases. And nothing. No hits. No suspects. The killer wasn't in the system. Even stranger, when they followed up on the jacket and the knife sheath, the trails went cold. The Arizona shop had no record of the purchase. The jacket could have come from a thrift store, or a surplus outlet, bought by anyone. It was as if the killer had appeared from nowhere, carried out the crime, and vanished again. If you're getting the sense that this case was designed to torment investigators, you're right. Stick with me, because we'll explore the most chilling theory about why the killer left so much evidence, and why that evidence only deepens the mystery instead of solving it. The killer who wanted to be found. For detectives working the Johnson case, the first few days felt almost surreal. Most homicide investigations are built around scraps of evidence, one fingerprint, one hair strand, one partial witness statement. But here, inside this California home, it felt like the killer had practically gift-wrapped himself. Fingerprints on surfaces. Footprints tracked in blood. Hair samples in the shower drain. A jacket that didn't belong. Even DNA on a half-eaten ice cream container. And yet, none of it was leading anywhere. The puzzle with too many pieces. One investigator later described it like this: it's as if the killer dumped an entire jigsaw puzzle on the table, but the pieces were from 5 different boxes. Each clue pointed in a different direction. The shoe prints led to a brand barely sold in the US. The jacket fibers suggested military surplus, but not necessarily American. The DNA markers didn't match any single ancestry clearly, it seemed almost deliberately confusing. The sand in the pockets came from Nevada, but no one could connect the killer to the region. It was evidence, yes, but evidence that contradicted itself. And that's when a chilling theory began to emerge. What if the killer wanted investigators to find it all? The psychology of staying behind. Most killers, especially in cases this violent, flee immediately. The longer they stay, the higher the risk of being caught. But the Johnson killer didn't leave. He lingered. He ate their food. He used their bathroom. He surfed the internet. To investigators, this spoke volumes. It suggested confidence, comfort, even ownership. Some profilers argued it was a dominance display, the killer staking his claim, sending a message, "This is my space now." Others went darker. Maybe he wasn't just comfortable staying, maybe he enjoyed being surrounded by what he had done. Maybe he relished the silence of the house, the eerie stillness of the bodies just a few rooms away. And maybe, just maybe, he wanted the world to know he'd been there. The suspect pool. As detectives sifted through leads, they began assembling a list of possible suspects. 1. A random drifter. The sheer brutality, coupled with the odd jacket and sand grains, suggested someone transient, maybe a drifter moving through the region. But if that were the case, how did he leave so much evidence and never surface again? 2. Someone close to the family. Statistically, most family murders are committed by someone the victims know. A disgruntled friend, an ex-lover, a jealous neighbor. But every relative, every friend, every coworker was interviewed, and all were cleared. 3. A professional killer. Some detectives briefly considered the possibility of a hitman. But professional killers don't leave behind a buffet of evidence. And they certainly don't raid the fridge afterward. 4. A local with a secret. Could it have been someone from the neighborhood? Someone who seemed ordinary by day but lived a darker life in secret? Residents on Sycamore Lane began looking at each other differently, suspicion creeping into every interaction. Still, no matter how hard they dug, no solid lead emerged. Theories that terrify. By the 6-month mark, the case had shifted from solvable to legendary, not because it was solved, but because of how unsolvable it seemed. And with that shift came theories. The arrogance theory. Some profilers believed the killer was arrogant, almost taunting police. He left evidence because he didn't think they could catch him. And so far, he was right. The psychotic break theory. Others thought it was the work of someone mentally unstable. The randomness of the clues, the comfort inside the house, the lack of escape plan, it all pointed to someone in the throes of a breakdown. The ghost theory. Believe it or not, locals began whispering about the house being cursed. How else could a killer leave that much behind and still vanish into thin air? But among all the theories, one stood out the most, one that left even hardened detectives unsettled. The hunter theory. It came from a veteran profiler, a man who had studied dozens of serial killers. His theory was chilling: the Johnson murders weren't random. They were a hunt. The killer, he argued, had chosen the family deliberately. He had entered their home quietly, stalked them from room to room, and killed them in a frenzy. Then, instead of fleeing, he claimed the space, like a predator lounging near its kill. The evidence wasn't random at all, it was a trophy room. Each fingerprint, each footprint, each hair, was left on purpose. Not to get caught, but to remind investigators, I was here. This was mine. If that doesn't give you chills, it should, because it means the killer may not have been afraid of being caught at all. And if he wasn't afraid then, what's to say he wouldn't do it again? Community in fear. As months turned into a year, the Johnson murders became a scar on the community. The once safe suburb was now synonymous with horror. Families installed alarm systems. Gun sales went up. And every creak in the night had parents sitting upright in bed. The Johnson house itself sat dark, its cheerful decorations long gone, replaced by boarded windows and overgrown grass. No one wanted to buy it. No one wanted to live near it. It became the haunted house of Sycamore Lane, except the ghost wasn't supernatural. He was flesh and blood. And he was still out there. The investigation stalls. Detectives kept at it, rerunning DNA, double-checking leads, even traveling out of state to follow threads about the jacket and shoes. But every time, the trail went cold. In one particularly cruel twist, the DNA markers suggested relatives of the killer might exist in the United States, but they couldn't be identified. Imagine that, somewhere out there, a cousin, an uncle, maybe even a sibling of the killer was living a normal life, completely unaware of the monster in their family tree. The case that wouldn't die. By the early 2000s, the Johnson murders had officially gone cold. But they never faded. Detectives who retired passed the case files to new recruits, each one staring at the mountain of evidence like a cursed puzzle they couldn't solve. The DNA, the fingerprints, the footprints, they were all still there, sitting in boxes, waiting. And with every passing year, the sense of unease grew. Because if this killer could do something so violent, leave so much evidence, and walk away untouched, what else was he capable of? The case takes a turn. New technologies, new leads, and shocking connections that suggest this killer might not have acted alone, or that the Johnson family wasn't his only target. Stay with me, because this is where the mystery deepens into something even darker. Ghosts in the evidence. For years after the Johnson murders, the evidence sat in boxes, sealed away in the cold case unit of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. Detectives would occasionally revisit it, flipping through photos of bloody footprints, jackets, and computer logs, hoping that some new detail would spark a breakthrough. But it wasn't until technology advanced that the case began to stir again. The DNA revolution. By the mid-2000s, DNA testing had come a long way. What once required large, clean samples could now be done with microscopic traces, skin cells, saliva, even degraded fragments. The Johnson evidence was sent for retesting. Scientists extracted more detail from the samples than ever before, building a genetic profile of the killer. And what they found was confusing. The profile showed markers tied to mixed ancestry, Eastern European, Hispanic, even faint traces pointing toward Asian lineage. It was the kind of blend you might expect in a cosmopolitan city like Los Angeles, but for investigators, it meant one thing: the suspect pool was essentially limitless. Still, there was hope. Genetic genealogy, the method that had cracked cases like the Golden State Killer, was on the rise. If the killer had relatives in public databases, there was a chance to finally identify him. But every time genealogists searched, they came up empty. No close relatives. No distant cousins. Nothing. It was as if the killer had dropped onto the planet fully formed, with no family tree to trace. The jacket that wouldn't go away. Meanwhile, detectives kept circling back to that military-style jacket left at the scene. It was the one physical object they could hold, touch, and test. Forensic fiber analysis showed it had been washed multiple times but still carried microscopic particles, tiny fragments of desert sand and a chemical used in industrial cleaning products. Some experts suggested the sand matched terrain near Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. This sparked a new theory. Was the killer ex-military? Someone who had spent time at the base, maybe even trained there? But military records didn't reveal anyone with matching DNA or fingerprints. Again, a dead end. A connection too strange to ignore. Then, in 2006, something eerie happened. Detectives in Arizona reported a case with disturbing similarities. A family of 3 in a small town outside Phoenix had been murdered in their home. The crime scene bore chilling echoes of the Johnson case. Multiple weapons used. Evidence of the killer staying behind to eat and linger. Footprints tracked in blood. The investigators compared notes. The shoe prints were different, the DNA didn't match, but the signature was nearly identical. For the first time, detectives wondered if the Johnsons weren't the only victims. Could this be the work of a serial predator who traveled across state lines? The shadow of a pattern. Over the next decade, analysts began combing through unsolved homicides across the Southwest. They flagged at least 4 cases with eerily similar elements. Families killed in their own homes. Evidence of the killer staying behind. DNA and prints that led nowhere. Each case seemed disconnected on the surface. Different states, Different times, different methods of entry. But the behavioral signature, that unnerving comfort inside the crime scene, was a thread tying them together. This raised a terrifying possibility. The Johnson murders weren't an isolated explosion of violence. They were part of something much bigger. The lone wolf or the phantom network? As investigators built their database, they realized something else. The DNA markers from the Johnson case didn't just point to a single person, they might point to a group. Some scientists suggested that the genetic profile could actually belong to siblings or close relatives, meaning there could be more than one perpetrator. If true, it explained how the killer could seem to vanish, because it wasn't one person, but potentially multiple, acting independently yet with the same chilling method. The thought was horrifying. A family murder spree carried out not by one phantom killer, but by a network of predators bound by blood. The community's trauma. Back in Los Angeles, the Johnson case continued to haunt the neighborhood of Sycamore Lane. The house where the murders happened sat empty for years, until eventually, it was demolished. A new home was built in its place, but locals swore the energy on that corner never felt the same. Children who grew up there recalled not being allowed to trick or treat near the house. Parents told cautionary tales, warning their kids to lock the doors tight. For them, the Johnson murders weren't a cold case, they were a living ghost story. The investigators' obsession. Even as years turned into decades, the Johnson murders became a rite of passage for young detectives. New recruits would be handed the thick case file, told to take a crack at it. None of them could make sense of the contradictions. One detective, now retired, admitted, it felt like the killer was always one step ahead, like he was laughing at us. Every time we thought we had him cornered, the evidence twisted in another direction. Some investigators grew convinced that the case would never be solved. Others believed time was the only missing ingredient, that eventually, DNA genealogy would catch up, and the killer's bloodline would betray him. The darkest possibility. But there was one theory that investigators rarely spoke about publicly. What if the Johnson killer had connections in law enforcement or the military? It would explain the jacket, the strange mix of DNA that didn't hit any databases, and the sheer confidence to linger in the house. Who else would understand investigative procedures well enough to leave evidence that went nowhere? It was a terrifying thought, that the person responsible might have been hiding in plain sight, maybe even among those who were sworn to protect. This is the part of the story where you realize, the Johnson murders weren't just a tragedy. They were a message. We'll confront the chilling legacy of this crime, the enduring mystery of the killer's identity, and why some investigators believe he may still be out there. Don't miss it. Shadows without faces. The investigation into the Suburban family murders grew colder with each passing year. Detectives had mountains of evidence, yet no suspect. They had DNA. They had fingerprints. They had shoe prints. They even had items the killer himself left behind. On paper, it looked like an airtight case waiting for a name to be matched. And yet, every test came back empty. No hits in national databases. No familial DNA matches. No suspects strong enough to pursue. It was as if this man had appeared from the shadows, committed one of the most horrific crimes in American history, and then dissolved back into nothingness. The haunting silence of the neighborhood. Neighbors never forgot that night. Some described hearing a single thud, others claimed they saw a flicker of lights after midnight, but no one knew the horror taking place just yards away from their own beds. Many moved away, unable to live under the shadow of a house that had become a tomb. For the families left behind, life never returned to normal. Holidays were quiet. Birthdays became reminders of absence. The once bright suburban street turned into a scar of paranoia and fear. Children grew up being told, lock your doors. Trust no one. Evil doesn't always look like evil. The unanswered questions. Why this family? Why this house? And what made the killer stay after the murders? Did he feel ownership over what he had done? Was he taunting investigators, leaving them with clues that should have cracked the case but never did? Or was it something darker, something ritualistic, something that only made sense to him? The longer the case remained unsolved, the more theories grew. Some believed it was a drifter, a man who passed through and vanished forever. Others thought it might have been someone closer, someone in the community, blending in, watching as detectives searched for him year after year. A chilling possibility. One of the most unsettling parts of this case is that the killer might still be alive today. He could be living in another city, maybe another state. He could be someone who works a normal job, who goes to the grocery store, who smiles at his neighbors, and no one would ever know. And perhaps the most haunting thought of all, if he got away with it once, what would stop him from doing it again? If this story gripped you the way it's haunted investigators for decades, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because I'll always bring you the darkest, strangest, and most mysterious true crime stories. You won't want to miss the next one. The legacy of fear. The suburban family home was eventually demolished. The lot was left empty, a hollow space where laughter and life once filled the air. For locals, it was a relief to see the structure gone, but the land itself seemed to carry an invisible weight. Even years later, people walking by said they felt uneasy, as though something still lingered there. The case remains unsolved. The family is gone. And the killer? He is still out there, somewhere. And until he is found, this story will never truly end.